Welcome to the Climate Commission podcast. My name is Sonya and I am your host. I am also the Climate Commission Officer for the Climate Commission for UK Higher and Further Education. And the Climate Commission is a unique partnership between Association of Colleges, EAUC, Guild HE and Universities UK, and we're working to coordinate climate action in the sector by the end of the year, but also looking forward to COP26 in November next year. And students are at the heart of our work, and they've been really active in sharing their insights and their opinions for what we need for the future. And this is another way that students can do that through this podcast. And so I'm really excited to share ideas from students with you today, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome back to the Climate Commission podcast, Climate Chats with Students. We have been on a small hiatus, but we're back now, and I'm really, really excited because we have Chris Holdsworth speaking with us. And Chris is a first-year student at the university, PhD student rather, at the University of Edinburgh. And I first met Chris because he participated in the UNESCO Futures of Education discussion group, and it was really lovely having him there. And and so now we're going to just chat more about Chris's pathway and his education and interest in the climate crisis. And
really excited to chat.
So I'm just going to start with a really simple general question. So you are a first year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh working on carbon capture and storage in geosciences. And so could you just kind of guide us through your pathway to where you are now? So I know that you did geology and earth sciences at the University of Glasgow and also a bit of geography. So do you mind just talking a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so my my first interest in stuff that's related to the climate crisis started in high school or secondary school, doing GCSE and then A-level geography. And essentially at that time I was just kind of interested in how like the natural world works, your classic sort of like physical geography topics like earthquakes, rivers, natural hazards. But then I also, as I went through, particularly in my A-levels, kind of started to develop an interest in how humans interact with that, because, I mean, learning about the natural world and how it works is great, but we live on a human planet.
Yeah.
And, how humans interact with those different aspects of the earth is something that I found really interesting. So I then applied to do geography originally as an undergraduate at Glasgow University. And the Scottish system's a wee bit different. So you have 4 years. So your first 2 years, you essentially do a mix of subjects, and then you choose which one you want to do for your honours or your actual degree. And I basically, for the first 2 years, and ahed about whether to do geography or earth science, which is kind of, earth science is often what geology degrees used to be. It's kind of been almost like rebranded in some ways. But what I found at uni was that geography, and this will vary, I'm sure, by university, but at the course I was doing, it was a bit more sort of human and social based than the kind of physical stuff, which was still my kind of core interest. So essentially, I had a big sort of like, it was several months that I sort of took to decide about which one I was going to do.
I guess that's quite understandable as like a 18-year-old having to decide your future.
Yeah, and I think every stage of like your academic or educational life, it's so difficult to know what you need to know to make these decisions. But I spoke to different lecturers and just tried to kind of sound them out, but like, okay, if I do geography, what does that give me? If I do earth science, what does that give me? And ultimately it came down to two things why I ended up doing earth science. Was that, first of all, the course at Glasgow was much more sort of physical science based, so the scientific skill set, the research skills in physical sciences I would have got were much better. And also the field work. The geology course at Glasgow, you get to do a lot of field work around Scotland, and that was something that was very appealing to me. And I think a lot of people that do geography and earth science, it's appealing to them because ultimately you want to get outdoors and explore a bit. So I ended up doing that. And then do you want me to talk about how I got into the PhD after that as well? Yeah.
Yeah. So your master's was, so your undergrad was in earth sciences and geology,
Yes.
and then you a research master's.
Yep.
And now you're doing geosciences, carbon capture and storage. So yeah. So what was like the next sort of step to doing this PhD?
Yeah. Well, so I finished. I'm sure as everyone that's in or done a final year of university as a undergraduate, you get this to the stage where like, oh my God, what do I want to do with my life, or what do I want to do next? And you know, like I'm sure a lot of people, I wasn't really sure. So the reason I ended up doing a research master's at Glasgow for another year, and well, it was almost two in the end, was during my dissertation in my undergraduate, my supervisor that I'd had on my project there was offering this research master's project. And the thing that was quite nice about doing a research master's was it essentially gave me a 1 or 2 year preview of what a research degree, a PhD, would be like.
Yeah.
And I knew him, you know, I liked the project. Again, it added to my skills. It wasn't ultimately like what I absolutely wanted to end up doing, but it was a very good stepping stone for me, and a kind of preview into, yeah, what is it like to be a research student.
Yeah.
And then essentially, yeah, through doing that, gaining some more skills working in the lab. So my PhD's working with certain isotopes and gases, and some of the experience I got from my research masters and my undergraduate was relevant for the PhD project that I eventually selected. And I think once I'd done that research masters, and I was like, okay, I could work in, I could do a PhD, but I'd want to make sure it's absolutely the right project. I don't want to just do a PhD for the sake of it.
Yeah.
And I essentially then went through a process of watching when the PhD projects generally came out, which at Edinburgh was around November time, I think. But at the same time, I also applied for a job at the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. In fact, it was their graduate scheme.
Yeah.
So I was very close. I essentially ended up having to choose between going to the assessment centre for that and going to the interview for the PhD.
Wow. Yeah. That's like a real like fork in the road, crossroads type life situation.
Yeah, totally. And I think I said this earlier, I'm sure everyone has several points in their life where you come to those situations. And I think the thing I always found most effective is get the advice of people you trust, but literally just write down the pros and cons of both the options and go with what looks more beneficial, but also like you actually want more. And the thing about my PhD project, sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, like what intuitively also just feels right to you.
Yeah. Which is sometimes really hard to gauge. But I think with my PhD project, it was essentially the perfect combination of science, physical science that I was interested in. And, you know, you kind of like lab work. So I work, like I said, with isotopes. And what I love about working with isotopes is you can infer incredible sort of conclusions from the most tiny amount of information that you've got from a sample.
Wow,
But at the same time, I don't want to just be in the lab the whole time. My project's very applied. It's very linked in with the climate crisis. I'm working with a team out in Iceland. So yeah, I think half of these things are almost about trying to work out what you sort of want from whatever your next step is, and working out what you want is one of the hardest things. But it's I don't know. It's just almost about building up those blocks of trying to figure out what you really want.
Just trying to experience different things. And I think you did that with, you know, doing your 2-year research masters and just trying to like have background knowledge, if that makes sense. But so your PhD is in carbon capture and storage, which is obviously really important and is becoming increasingly topical and popular as we near our emission targets and you know, as we're living in the climate crisis. So was carbon capture and storage something that you studied previously to your PhD? How did you find it, and how did you, you know, decide to study this for the next essentially 4 years?
Well, I think it's probably quite an interesting journey. So when I first came across carbon capture and storage, maybe like 6 or 8 years ago, my first impression I remember was like, oh no, here we go again. Sort of, this is just another excuse to, keep as we were, keep burning fossil fuels,
Yeah.
all of that sort of spiel.
Yeah.
And just through studying and interest in the climate crisis and climate change, I became very much more aware and read much more about the sort of policy background and essentially how governments and organizations were trying or planning to mitigate the issue. And to be honest, over the past 2 years, the thing that's really caught my attention with CCS, carbon capture and storage, is when you look at essentially what's needed over the next 10 years in terms of emissions reductions. And the one stat that I found out, I think it was around the time I was, it was around the time I was applying for my project, is so the UN did, towards the end of last decade, did a review on emission trends in light of what do we need to do to get to 1.5 degrees warming or to stay on track for that over the next decade. And they worked out that on average, every year of the 2020s, we need nearly an 8% reduction of emissions every year.
Yeah.
And that's coming off the back of a decade where we've had 1.5% rise average every year.
Yeah.
And I think hearing that, and also looking at how now carbon budgets, which are a massive part of the international effort around climate change, it's, and this is said in the IPCC reports now, and the Committee on Climate Change reports in the UK as well, carbon capture and storage it's not an option, unfortunately. If we want to stick to those 1.5 degree targets, we will need it. And whilst there are issues and conversations and decisions to be had about how that's done, it's better that it's done right and done well than sort of just thrown together at the last minute. So I think the two things that always come up with carbon capture and storage is it not just an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels, and is it safe? Yeah. So I essentially realized, like, oh my God, right, we really are going to need this. So how can I take the skill sets I've accrued through my undergraduate and masters, the isotope work, all that sort of stuff, and apply it to something like carbon capture and storage, which is sort of it's still very much a development in the arsenal of things we're going to use to fight climate change. Yeah. So that's how it came to my attention. It was sort of, I started off a skeptic, I'd say, and then sort of read into it a bit more, watched how the scene was developing over the sort of back end of the 2010s, and then really kind of realized, okay, we're going to need this. And it's going to be something, whether we really like it or not. And I know, I think for some people that's quite a difficult, or it's not a very nice message to have, but it's just, I just try and view it as like a pragmatic approach. Be like, if we want to stick to 1.5 degrees, and we do for good reason, we're going to need this. So
and I think it's just also quite realistic to be like, all right, we're going to need this, so let's learn how to do it correctly, as you said. Let's make sure. Yeah.
I don't know if people would want to know about a bit more about carbon capture and storage, because, and the only reason I say that is because I don't know if you've watched, are you on Netflix at all? Yeah. So Zac Efron has done.
Oh gosh, he's doing that show, that like travels show.
Yes, and it's a bit, it can be a bit hit and miss. But in the first episode, they go to Iceland and they visit the power plant where I'm essentially going to be working at.
Right. Okay.
And I just wondered, because I think I said to you about how the two things that always come up with CCS is it not just an excuse for the status quo, and is it safe? Yeah. And I didn't know, it might be a bit too technical though, but like how...
Do you think you could explain it to like a 10-year-old?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, so the way I usually explain it, if I'm, like I went back to my old school and talked about it. We all learn about the water cycle, right? How water cycles through the environment and goes to different parts of it, like the oceans, up in clouds, and it generally, nature works by all these different cycles. And when we look at climate change and carbon dioxide or fossil fuel emissions, we're looking at the carbon cycle. And essentially what's wrong, why climate change is happening, is we have imbalanced that cycle. We've taken a load of carbon out the ground and put it into the atmosphere way quicker than it would have ever naturally done so.
Yeah.
Now, there are certain natural mechanisms for getting carbon back into the ground. And one of them is essentially weathering of rocks. So acid rain, if you get any sort of rain falling on rocks, it can dissolve parts of those rocks, and the CO2 in the air can react and form stones. Right. And essentially my PhD is doing that in an engineered way. So we try and speed it up, and we do it underground in Iceland. So rather than injecting the CO2 and storing it as a fluid or something like that, we turn it to stone.
Why would people think, I don't know if this is, I'm not at all well versed in this topic, so why would people think that that would be unsafe? It just seems sort of like,
Well, so when carbon capture and storage was first floated as an idea, and to be honest, the more major projects on it will pursue this way. A UK example would be, you would take your CO2, however you've got that, whether it's from emissions of vehicles or whatever, or it's from when you're producing hydrogen from natural gas, and you would inject it underground as a supercritical fluid, supercritical liquid or a fluid, and you'd store it. Essentially, if you imagine oil and gas, the way oil and gas is stored underground in these reservoirs, you do the reverse. So you put the CO2 back into, well, not so much oil and gas reservoirs, but storage formations that are suitable to store that securely.
Right.
Now, when it first came out and people were explaining this idea, essentially people worried that because it was still a liquid, that it could make its way back to the surface. Now, there's been there's been a fair few studies on that form of carbon dioxide storage since, and it's very unlikely, but it still has this, it's still not, I think, viewed on as, the general public opinion is still not, the jury seems to be still out on it a little bit.
Right.
But I mean, the way we always talk about carbon capture and storage, so essentially you can, when you store carbon underground, you can store it either as a gas, a liquid, in you can dissolve it. So essentially, your fizzy drinks.
Yeah.
Do that. You make a fizzy drink, store it underground.
Yeah.
You can store it in tiny, tiny holes in the rock, pore spaces, or you can turn it into stone like we do.
What we're doing,
the payoff is that usually to get to stone takes longer, but that's what we've been working on, and we've found that you can do it, or the team in Iceland have found that you can do it very quickly.
Brilliant. This is all really interesting, because I think you can study geology and you can study geography and not have it relate to the climate crisis at all. So why, I just want to know, when did you first become interested in / concerned with the climate crisis? Because I think it is easy, to do all these subjects and to learn all these things without having this interest, but you do have this interest. So if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say, even when I was at high school and doing my A-levels and stuff, I was aware of climate change.
Yeah.
But I think, like so many people, when you go to university, it does, I mean, climate change links so much into like social issues as well. But I think as you go to university, you start to read more and just engage with literature and stuff. That makes you aware of it. But I think, to be honest, the moment for me, well, there's not a single moment, but I think the thing for me that really hit home was whether you are doing specific climate change modules or not in geology or earth science, you learn about the history of like deep time and the history of the earth, the sort of, the fact it's 4.5 billion years old, and how earth has evolved through time. And I think with so many issues, they're only really focused in people's minds until they have a context or something to compare it against that kind of shows the scale of this issue that you're talking about, which in this instance is climate change. And I think you know, a lot of people, I think, probably find the idea of Earth history in 4.5 billion years really daunting. What I think is really humbling about it is it puts into context issues like climate change. And for climate change, it really focuses in on how serious and how unprecedented it is. I know unprecedented has been used so many times over the past 6 months, but
Gosh, what a
you know,
word.
and not only that, actually, what it does as well is it kind of, you know, the climate crisis is like no other crisis because you can't really react to it. You have to be proactive. And I think, you know, take the coronavirus pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've known that pandemics are one of the biggest threats to humankind. This has been known for quite a while. I know people like Bill Gates have spoken about it a lot, but never really had everyone's attention until 2020, right?
Yeah.
Now, we've been able to do, obviously, it hasn't, I would never call the coronavirus pandemic a success, but we've managed to sort of get, well, I don't know, depends who you speak to, but there has been a level of control now gained, which we didn't have, say, maybe 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah.
Now,
and globalization, in a sense, coordination.
Yes. And I don't want to say it's easier to deal with, but the example I'd use, you know, sea level rise is always talked about when it comes to climate change. So I'm sat up on the Cromarty Firth here in the Highlands, and the sea is just, it's not very far away from this house I'm sat in. Now, in 100 years' time, when sea level rise is really taking its toll, if you haven't really paid attention to the climate crisis, but then suddenly the sea's at your door, and you're like, oh God, I've got to do something about this.
Yeah.
You know, you can try and mitigate it. You can build flood defenses, whatever, but you're decades too late. Yeah. And I think that's the other aspect, that doing something like geology, it gives you an appreciation of how there's this, compared to like a traditional human time scale or lifespan, there's this lag. You know, what we decide to do in the next 10 years will dictate the future or the severity of climate change for the next 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's when you do something like geology, you very quickly see that right in front of you. But I think unless you have done something like that, it's really quite hard to envisage, because it just operates on a completely different timescale. So I think that's how geology and the climate crisis, or my interest in it's interacted. It's really put the severity or the magnitude of the challenge into focus and context.
Yeah, like it's, I guess, the perspective that you've gained from studying geology and earth sciences, is quite different than just human geography, because the I guess you get to see the bigger picture of it, you know, like the billions of years, as opposed to just the Anthropocene.
But I also think as well, you know, I think sometimes people in physical sciences, and I know this works both ways, but there can be a bit of what's the word? You know, a bit of teasing either way in terms of human and physical geography. But whilst physical geography and geology and things like that give you the context of the actual, you know, physical science behind climate change, I think where human geography comes in is how then, like I said before, why I was interested in it, how then humans interact with that. How do we go about having a just transition from a carbon-based economy to a low-carbon economy? That's where I think geography is uniquely placed to deal with that, because it crosses, and very few subjects do, it crosses that natural human boundary. And I think that's priceless in terms of your ability to fully grasp the issue and tackle it effectively as well.
Yeah, so I guess we could speak about this later, but there is this conversation that we need interdisciplinary learning to really understand the climate crisis and adapt to it. And in a sense, geography is inherently interdisciplinary. Is that what you would say?
Oh, for sure. And I think the shame about it, you know, in certain situations at universities, is it can become very segmented. You know, you get, and for good reason, because, you know, when you go to do some sort of academic degree, it's often you're going to specialize in something. You're going to be an expert in something. So of course you have to have your like niche, but with an issue like climate change, it really does dictate. It's not just a one-faceted issue. Like it dictates all these different components to it, and you either need to be, well, ideally you want to be able to operate and be effective in a few of them, but also be good at working with other, so you get a climate change scientist that can really effectively work with economists and on green investment, who can also work on social change and like we were saying about just transition. So
look, we could talk about that later when we try and figure out how we want to see geology and higher education taught in the future. Sure. I just want to ask you, because you did mention that you find it interesting that subjects like geology kind of might have a bad rap amongst individuals concerned by the climate crisis because of fossil fuels and mining and whatnot. Do you want to talk a bit about that and just talk about what's going on with geology and the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about this on a broader level, because it's something that now I think has the attention more of people within geology. And in some ways, I think, to be honest, it's linked to sort of wider political discourse we have at the moment, how issues are often painted very black and white, or right and wrong. And geology for years, or for decades in the UK anyway, geology was an obvious and very lucrative pathway to the fossil fuel industry in the North Sea. And there are still, on a much reduced level, that still exists. And equally, so if I think about my year for undergraduate year I was in at Glasgow, we've got people working on PhDs on stuff like consultancy, got people working in mining, people working for fossil fuel companies. And I think, with these issues, there's two sides to the argument. I think people generally now fossil fuel companies are seen as bad companies, and I think that's fair in the sense of the fossil fuel industry has been asleep at the wheel for decades now. They could have done something decades ago to get ahead of all this, to really tackle the issue. They had, and they had so much wealth at their disposal as well, and that is, in some ways that is criminal, the way they've behaved and just completely neglected the issue. However, at the same time, there's other sides to it, in the sense of, there's a lot of politics that come into it with oil and gas, but they in the UK anyway, say in the northeast of Scotland, down the east coast of the UK, they've provided high-skilled, high-paid jobs for a long time. They're, people that have those jobs, and if the fossil fuel industry suddenly folds, I'm not saying it's going to, but that they're highly skilled jobs and people that are out of a job. There's other aspects to the side of, well, I think oil and gas, quite rightly, we shouldn't be burning it because of climate change, but around half of the oil that we extract from the ground doesn't get used as fuel. It gets used as stuff like petrochemicals, goes into making materials. I think that's missed, that oil is so entrained in our entire society, all of the materials, so many different materials and chemicals that we make. I don't think it's quite as simple as just stopping getting it out the ground, because we rely on it so much. And then with mining, I think mining's even more complicated, because mining is, again, I think generally seen as quite a dirty industry, and that's totally fair in some regards, in terms of pollution, in terms of working regulations abroad and the way it infringes on, I think particularly in developing countries, it's very, very exploitative. But at the same time, again, even more so than oil, we're probably both sat in rooms right now where almost everything has come from the ground, so in some shape or form. And we're chatting on technology, we've all got smartphones, they all rely on critical metals. We're going to an electric world in the current direction that a lot of developed countries are going. Those electric batteries, they need to come out of the ground somewhere. So I think there's this disconnect between I totally understand and think to an extent it's fair that the mining industry and the fossil fuel industry are seen as dirty and get a lot of flack. I think that criticism is totally fair. However, I think the point that's missed is we are whether you like it or not, we're incredibly dependent on both of those industries, particularly mining, even more so.
Yeah.
And if we want to continue to live the lifestyle we do, and in the, you know, the houses with the technology we do, we need those industries, and we need them to operate fairly, you know, ecologically, sustainably, all these things. So it's not, I think this is why I say it's quite complicated, and I think it's got a lot of people within these industries worrying, because to a lot of young people in particular, they're not even worth touching with a barge pole. And I totally understand that, but equally, we still need all the things that we have right now. So I think it's a conversation, or the issue isn't given the full coverage or kind of unpacked as much as it needs to be. And I guess I would implore anyone who is sort of interested in sustainability or the climate crisis to just, consider and explore that a bit more, because quite rightly, if we're going to an electric world, that's brilliant for carbon emissions, but we've got to get those raw materials from somewhere. And to be honest, I think it's almost in some ways related to the fact, particularly in the Western world, we don't even really have to think or consider about where our stuff comes from. You know, you buy a new phone.
Disconnected,
Yeah, and you have no connection or even awareness, or very, you know, you'd be hard pressed to get good awareness on where or how your phone has come to be. We're so removed from that, and I think that's why it's very easy, or it's so common to be like, oh yeah, I think the oil and gas industry and the mining industry are really dirty, they need to stop, like they're just bad people. When, you know, you're probably like tweeting that off a smartphone, and that's not like a fault of anyone, not at all. I think it's just more a conversation that needs to be had on a societal level, and just people need to be a bit more aware of it. We don't get things for free, sort of thing, if that makes sense. So I've probably rambled quite a lot there, but
no, it's okay. I do think it's interesting, because I guess like in lots of climate conscious circles I'm in, and just lots of conversations I have, I guess people that are against mining and fossil fuel industries also are people that are like fighting or trying to work towards a complete restructuring of society, which is you know, which is when we don't have to tweet hashtags, and we don't have to so I just think it is really interesting that like we need that restructuring if we have to be very like anti mining and oil and gas.
I think that's what you're saying though about you know, because I've been in certain groups, I've been involved in like various climate activist groups and had those kind of conversations with people, and I think, you know, there is totally a conversation to be had about there's, you know, we shouldn't just stick with, you know, fix the climate crisis and keep everything else in society the same. There are definitely things that we could improve, people like screen time, all that sort of stuff, how reliant people are on technology, how reliant we are on these raw materials. But I think if I link this kind of conversation back to the climate crisis, if we don't do what we need to do to keep to 1.5 degrees in the next 10 years, the world will not see 1.5 degrees warming. We have to get this right in the next 10 years. And I think this is where I come back to the severity and the magnitude of the issue, or the pressing nature of it. We have to do what is going to make sure that we hit that target. And I think whilst I'd love the idea of like not having to tweet and completely restructuring society, history tells us, and generally just, general political or social appetite would tell us that that is less likely to achieve that in the timescale we have available to us. So whilst it's not perfect, and I know when you kind of suggest that compromise, it often sounds like, oh, well, you know, you're just giving people more credence to burn more fossil fuels, to all that sort of stuff. I'm not, with carbon capture and storage, that is not why we're going to need to do it. It is not a substitute for emissions reductions.
Yeah.
There's no point in doing CCS unless you are doing all those other things that we need to be doing.
Yeah.
It's just about the magnitude and the pressing nature of the issue, is what I would argue as to why, you've got to just try and, I think we just have to focus on getting this right, because it's so urgent, in terms of achieving that 1.5 degree target.
Yeah. So in terms of getting it right, you're asking for like more, I guess, nuanced understanding of actually what's going on in geology and in those industries.
I think it's a two-way process, because I think too often the oil and gas sector and the mining sector in the past have come out and said people need to understand what we do. What we do is important, and yes, there needs to, I think people should be more aware. It's more about acknowledging, okay, I think the oil and gas, I think BP and Shell and all them are not great companies, and they've kind of, ruined the environment for a bit. But at the same time, I'm probably wearing products or use products on a daily basis that are made from oil. Acknowledging that, and so it's a two-way conversation. Those companies can't be like, the public need to understand us. They need to make a serious effort to, even to some extent, come out and be like, look, we got this wrong. We should have dealt with this properly decades ago. We haven't, but we're going to do everything we can now to put this right, and really not just like greenwash things. I think there's so often with oil and gas companies, they'll come out and say, oh, we're investing X million in renewables, when it's actually like 0 point something% of their annual revenue. So I think, it's a two-way process. I think people acknowledge, okay, everything that I use comes out the ground pretty much. But these companies making a proper effort to be like, look, and we've been at conferences before where these, a lot of the oil and gas executives will come out, or the mining companies, and be like, we are important for society. And it's like, everyone in that room knows, that's in geology and stuff, knows that they are. But what they just seem to fail to grasp sometimes is that they are already losing that argument, or in some ways have already lost it. And it's not good enough for them to anymore just sort of stand up and be like, we're so important, give us, you have to appreciate us. No, they have to prove their importance, whilst also people realizing that we are reliant on raw materials, and we're not sort of immune to that. So it's very complicated.
It is, isn't it?
But I think it definitely falls foul of this kind of tribal politics that we have at the moment, where everything's either right or wrong. Nothing is like, how often in reality are things just right or wrong? That's so often not so rare. But
no, that's really, really interesting, and a fascinating insight into the way we live, and the fact that we do rely on a lot of these resources that are deemed harmful, which they are, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. So if we just go back to the subject of geology and earth sciences and geography, looking forward, and to prepare for a changing climate, and also amid the climate crisis that we're currently in, how would you like to see these subjects taught in primary schools, high schools, and also in university degrees? It's a very big question.
And I think, as ever, when you ask someone's opinion on this, it's going to be very subjective. But
we did talk about this quite a bit during the UNESCO, and I know conversations about interdisciplinary, and I think you mentioned that you want these subjects to prepare like students to be able to grow up in a changing world. But sorry.
No. I think it's totally like, you're really right to bring it up, because I mean, if you link it into education, like I think we talked about in the focus group, the fundamental point of education should be to prepare someone for the world they're going to go and work in, right? Whatever you want to go and work in. And I think this issue is going to dominate all of our lives, or it's always going to be there. And I mean, I'm biased, but to me, I'd be like, what more of a fundamental understanding is there to have than the planet we call home and how we interact with that? So I think for sure the difficulty is at school and even at university level, everyone's going to be better at different things, but giving people an opportunity to study about the different aspects of, you know, the physical planet, the human planet, how they interlink, and also, yeah, even if you don't want, and a lot of people won't want to go into something that's specifically interdisciplinary, but I think in many ways it links into political discourse as well. Learning that even if you're going to be super specialized in something, not to just exist in that echo chamber or that specific niche. Ultimately, you know, one of the biggest powerful tools, or one of the most powerful tools in the climate crisis, would be if more economists and entrepreneurs and people like that were on board. They are starting to get that way now, but if those two areas could talk more, you know, the people involved with the money and banks could mobilize more of that capital that could then be invested in the things that really make a difference with climate change. So I think, in terms of school and education, providing that opportunity to learn about the natural world, how humans interact with it, and just creating some sort of an understanding that I don't really know how to word it, that there's a mutual interest there in terms of ultimately the health of the planet and the health of ecosystems impacts on us, and it's the other way around as well.
Yeah, I really like what someone said. I don't know if it was in the session you attended, but someone said to teach the subjects alongside the climate crisis as like something you always carry with you.
Yes.
So I think that was kind of like, you carry it with you, and I just really like that phrasing. You know, it's always with you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it manifests itself in every part of life, really. You know, you could do modules in climate change and health. One of the really interesting ones I remember being alluded to at school, was it? No, I think, it was maybe during my A-levels, was the correlation between warming from climate change and conflict, in terms of where conflict happens in the world. And then other stuff like, you know, there's numerous examples of resource conflict over, say, fossil fuels or mining materials. But I mean, the kind of elephant in the room is water. So, you know, ultimately, our interaction with the natural world manifests itself in everything we do in life, whether it's health, government, money, whatever, name it, and it's linked. And I think, that idea of always having a component of the climate crisis in these different subjects would be very beneficial.
No, I guess just embed all of that everywhere you can.
And well, like I said, it's going to only become more prominent, and I think that's why, actually, while sea level rise is like one of obviously the kind of primary concerns of climate change, I think like it's a very good example of how the issue will probably evolve through the coming decades and even centuries, because sea level rise, you know, there's still a lot of uncertainty with how much sea level rise we'll get, because fundamentally that comes back to modeling ice sheets, and how they behave in a very complex climate system is very difficult. But what generally seems to be clear is the amount of sea level rise you get generally, like it's not exponential, but that curve, in terms of if you're going up meters or centimeters rise, the steepness of that curve generally can increase through time. So as you go through time, the issue becomes more and more pronounced. And more and more people have the sea on their doorsteps, and people are suddenly like, wow, this is a major issue in my life right now. Just trying to, I don't know, there's always a danger, like with education, you should never be ramming things down people's throats. That's not all what this is about. It's just I think, yeah, to be honest, it probably comes back a lot to about acknowledging, you know, we are so developed in some ways in our lifestyles and like how our society works and all these things, but it's just about remembering like the fundamental relationship we have with the only planet we know that we can currently exist on.
Yeah.
I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but unfortunately it's fundamental. And
It's imperative.
yeah. And you know, all these issues like population growth, that's another one that is like a massive elephant in the room. Population and the economic activity is incredibly closely linked to fossil fuel emissions at the moment. You know, a lot of economists reckon we could have 9 billion on the planet within a few decades. So how we manage that is also a massive issue. So they all link into these so big social, and if an issue is social, it ultimately impacts or interacts with us all. So
yeah, but thank you so much, Chris, for chatting with us today and talking about geology and understanding of what we actually study in geology and how we can use that to understand the climate crisis in the future.
No problem. Thanks for that's quite an intense activity to be doing for your first day back, I think.
Yeah, at 10 a.m. as well.
Yeah, I know.
I think we did quite well. We got some good conversation, some good banter.
No, yeah, and I hope it is useful. I hope it didn't rattle too much.
Very much so. And you're currently in the Highlands right now, so I hope you have a wonderful time.
Thank you.
In the beautiful Scottish nature.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad.